Margaret Chen had always lived a quiet life. At 52, she worked at the town library, stamping books and helping kids find stories about dragons and princesses. Her days were predictable. Wake up at 6, make coffee, feed the cat, and walk to work. Nothing exciting ever happened in Millbrook, and that was exactly how Margaret liked it. But life has a funny way of surprising us when we least expect it. It was a Tuesday morning when her daughter Lucy burst through the front door with a piece of paper in her hand. Lucy was 26 and had that restless energy that comes from wanting to change the world. She worked at the local newspaper and was always full of ideas. "Mom, you need to see this," Lucy said, waving the paper around like it was made of gold. Margaret looked up from her crossword puzzle. She was stuck on 7 across, hidden talent, and couldn't figure out the answer. "What is it, honey? You look like you've seen a ghost." Lucy sat down at the kitchen table, her eyes bright with excitement. "There's a casting call for that new talent show everyone's talking about. America's Hidden Voices. They're looking for ordinary people with extraordinary stories." Margaret went back to her crossword. "That's nice, dear. I'm sure someone from town will try out." "Mom," Lucy's voice got serious, "I want you to audition." The pencil slipped from Margaret's fingers. She looked at her daughter like she'd just suggested they rob a bank. "Me? Lucy, have you lost your mind?" "I'm completely serious. You have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard. Remember how you used to sing to me when I was little? And the way you sang to Dad when he was—" Lucy's voice trailed off. Margaret's husband Robert had passed away 6 months ago. The house still felt too quiet without his terrible jokes and the way he hummed while making breakfast. Margaret had stopped singing the day he died. "Lucy, I can't. I'm just a librarian. I don't belong on television." But Lucy wasn't giving up. She pulled out her phone and showed Margaret videos from the show. Regular people just like her, sharing their stories and their talents. A 70-year-old baker who rapped. A shy teenager who painted with sand. A construction worker who wrote poetry. Look at them, Mom. They're not professional performers. They're just people with something to share. Margaret watched the videos, feeling something stir in her chest. It had been so long since she'd thought about her voice as anything special. Growing up, she'd sung in the church choir, but that felt like a lifetime ago. After she married Robert and had Lucy, life got busy. Singing became something she did while washing dishes or tucking Lucy into bed. "I don't know, sweetie, what would I even sing?" Lucy smiled. "You'll figure it out. The casting call is this Saturday in the city. It's only 3 hours away. That night." Margaret couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about what Robert would say if he were here. He'd always told her she had a gift. "Your voice could heal broken hearts," he used to say, especially during his final months when the Alzheimer's made him forget so many things, but somehow he always remembered her songs. She got up and walked to their bedroom window. The moonlight made everything look different, like the world was holding its breath. She could almost hear Robert's voice. "You promised me you'd live, not just exist." The next morning, Lucy found Margaret at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a worried expression. "I've been thinking about what you said," Margaret began slowly. "About the audition?" Lucy sat down, trying not to look too hopeful. "And your father always believed I had something special. I never really believed him, but maybe I owe it to him to try. Just once." Lucy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You'll do it?" Margaret nodded, though her stomach was already doing flip-flops. "But I need you to promise me something. If I make a fool of myself, we never speak of this again." Saturday morning came too quickly. Margaret stood in front of her closet, feeling lost. What does a librarian wear to a talent show audition? She settled on her favorite floral dress, the one Robert had complimented her in last spring, and her comfortable cardigan. Lucy had offered to drive, but Margaret needed the 3 hours alone to think. The drive to the city felt like traveling to another planet. As the familiar hills of home disappeared behind her, Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. What was she doing? She was 52 years old, for crying out loud. She helped people find books about gardening and mystery novels. She wasn't meant for bright lights and cameras. But then she remembered Robert's last lucid moment. He'd taken her hand and said, "Don't let your music die with me." At the time, she thought he was just confused from the medication. Now she wondered if he'd been more clear-headed than anyone realized. The casting venue was a massive convention center in downtown. Margaret had to circle the parking lot 3 times before finding a spot. As she walked toward the building, she saw them. Hundreds of people lined up outside. Young, beautiful people with perfect hair and designer clothes. People who looked like they belonged on television. Margaret looked down at her simple dress and worn cardigan. This was a mistake, a huge mistake. She was about to turn around and go home when she remembered Lucy's words. They're just people with something to share. Maybe that was enough. Maybe having something to share was more important than looking perfect. Taking a deep breath, Margaret joined the line. The woman in front of her was barely 20, with bright pink hair and a sparkly outfit that probably cost more than Margaret's car payment. The man behind her was talking loudly on his phone about his brand and his platform. Margaret felt invisible, which wasn't unusual. She'd felt invisible most of her life. In school, she'd been the quiet girl who sat in the back row. At work, she was the helpful librarian who knew everyone's name but whom nobody really noticed. Even in her own home sometimes, she felt like she was fading into the wallpaper. But as she stood in that line, surrounded by all that youth and ambition and noise, something interesting happened. She started really listening to the conversations around her. The pink-haired girl was nervous about forgetting her choreography. The loud man was worried his voice would crack. The group of college friends nearby kept practicing their harmonies over and over. Everyone was scared. Everyone was hoping for something. And suddenly, Margaret didn't feel quite so alone. The line moved slowly. Margaret had brought a book, a habit from years of library work, but found herself too nervous to read. Instead, she people-watched and thought about Robert. He would have loved this adventure. He always said life was too short to play it safe. As the hours passed, Margaret began to feel something she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it wasn't fear either. It was possibility. Maybe Lucy was right. Maybe she did have something to share. Maybe it was time to find out. The inside of the convention center was even more overwhelming than the parking lot. Margaret had never seen so many people in one place, all buzzing with nervous energy and big dreams. The ceiling stretched up so high she had to crane her neck to see it, and the noise was incredible. Hundreds of conversations happening at once, mixed with music, laughter, and the occasional shriek of excitement or frustration. A young woman with a clipboard and a headset rushed past Margaret without even looking at her. Then another one, and another. Margaret realized these must be the production assistants Lucy had told her about, the people who helped organize everything and decided who got to audition. Margaret found herself swept along with the crowd toward a series of long tables where people were checking in. She got in what looked like the right line and waited. And waited. The line moved slower than molasses in January, as Robert used to say. The people around her were impossible to ignore. To her left, a group of young men were practicing some kind of dance routine, complete with backflips and moves that made Margaret's knees hurt. Just watching. They wore matching outfits that looked like they cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "We're going to crush this," one of them said loudly. "Our choreographer says we're the best group he's ever worked with." To her right, a woman who couldn't have been older than 25 was doing vocal warm-ups that sounded like a fire engine. She had on so much makeup that Margaret wondered how she could see through her false eyelashes. Her dress was so tight and short that Margaret found herself wanting to offer the girl her cardigan. "Do you think they'll put me on the main stage first?" the woman asked her friend. "I mean, obviously they will. Look at me. I'm exactly what television wants." Margaret looked down at her simple floral dress and comfortable shoes. Maybe this had been a mistake after all. These people were professionals, or at least they looked like they belonged here. She was just a small-town librarian who helped Mrs. Patterson find romance novels and taught story time to kindergartners. But she'd come this far. Robert always said you should finish what you start, even if it gets uncomfortable. When Margaret finally reached the check-in table, the production assistant barely glanced up from her computer screen. She was probably Lucy's age, with perfectly styled hair and nails that looked like tiny works of art. "Name?" the assistant asked in a bored voice. "Margaret Chen." "Age?" Margaret hesitated. 52. Now the assistant looked up, but not in a good way. Her eyes traveled from Margaret's gray-streaked hair down to her sensible shoes and back up again. It wasn't a mean look exactly, but it wasn't kind either. It was the look you give someone who's clearly in the wrong place. 52, the assistant repeated like she was making sure she'd heard correctly. "And you're here for the talent competition?" "Yes, ma'am." The assistant typed something into her computer, shaking her head slightly. "Okay, well, you'll need to wait over there with the others." She pointed toward a section of plastic chairs where people sat looking nervous. "Someone will call your number when it's time." Margaret took her number, 247, and found an empty chair. The plastic was uncomfortable, and she had to keep shifting to find a position that didn't make her back ache. Around her, the other contestants looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. Perfect hair, perfect teeth, perfect everything. A group of college girls nearby were scrolling through their phones, showing each other videos and photos. "Oh my God, look at this," one of them said. "This is from last season. Can you believe they let that old guy on stage? He was like 40 or something. So embarrassing." "I know, right?" Another one giggled. "Like, doesn't he know this show is for people who actually have a chance? Some people are so delusional." Margaret felt her cheeks burn. She pretended to read her book, but the words swam on the page. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was being delusional. She was old enough to be these girls' mother, and they were probably more talented than she'd ever been. The hours dragged by. Margaret watched as number after number was called. She saw people come back from their auditions, some crying with joy, others looking devastated. The rejection rate seemed brutal. For every person who came back smiling, 10 others looked like their world had ended. "Number 231, a woman about Margaret's age stood up. She wasn't dressed like the younger contestants. She wore slacks and a nice blouse like she was going to a church meeting. Margaret felt a little surge of hope. Maybe she wasn't the only one who didn't fit the typical mold. But 20 minutes later, the woman came back shaking her head. Her eyes were red, and she was mumbling something about wasting everyone's time. She gathered her purse and left without looking at anyone. Margaret's stomach dropped. If they wouldn't even give that nice-looking woman a chance, what hope did she have? Number 245, number 246. Margaret's number was next. Her heart started pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She tried to remember the breathing exercises Robert had taught her when she got anxious, but they weren't working. Number 247. This was it. Margaret stood up on shaky legs and followed the production assistant toward a smaller room off to the side. Her mouth felt like cotton, and she kept running her sweaty palms down her dress. The room had a long table with 3 people sitting behind it. 2 women and 1 man, all wearing the kind of clothes that screamed television industry. They had papers spread out in front of them and looked tired, like they'd been doing this all day. The man in the middle was clearly in charge. He had gray hair that probably cost more to style than Margaret spent on groceries in a month. And he wore the kind of watch that could probably pay for a year of college tuition. He looked up when Margaret walked in, and she saw something flicker across his face. Not quite surprised, but close to it, too, like he was seeing something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure what to do about it. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this is different." The woman to his left was shuffling through papers, but Margaret could tell she was really studying her appearance. The woman to his right was openly staring, like Margaret was some kind of curious animal that had wandered into the wrong habitat. "You're—" The man looked down at his papers. "Margaret Chen, age 52? "Yes, sir." "From Millbrook?" "Yes, sir." He exchanged glances with the 2 women. Margaret could practically hear them having a conversation without words. She'd seen that look before. The look people gave her when they were trying to figure out how to let her down easy. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice taking on that fake patient tone people use when they're talking to someone they think might not understand. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is a competitive talent show. We're looking for people who can, really perform. People who have that special something that television audiences want to see." Margaret felt her face get hot. "I understand that, sir. Do you?" He leaned forward and his expression wasn't unkind, but it wasn't encouraging either. "Because I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Chen. This show isn't really for people like you." The words hit Margaret like a slap. People like you. She'd heard variations of that phrase her whole life. Too quiet, too plain, too ordinary, too old. "I think," the man continued, standing up, "that you might be more comfortable at something like a community talent show. Or maybe your church has a choir you could join. This is really more for professional-level performers." He was walking toward the door now, clearly expecting her to follow. The meeting was over before it had really started. "I'm sorry you wasted your time coming all this way," he said, his hand already on the door handle. "But I'm sure you understand." Margaret did understand. She understood that she'd been judged the moment she walked in the room. She understood that her gray hair and comfortable shoes and simple dress had told them everything they thought they needed to know about her. What they didn't understand was that sometimes the most extraordinary things come in the most ordinary packages. Margaret stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like forever. The casting director's hand was still on the door handle, waiting for her to leave. The two women at the table had already turned their attention to the next stack of papers like she was already forgotten. This was it. This was the moment she was supposed to apologize for wasting their time, gather what was left of her dignity, and walk out. Drive the 3 hours home to Millbrook, tell Lucy it didn't work out, and go back to her quiet life of stamping books and feeding the cat. But something strange happened. Instead of moving toward the door, Margaret found herself thinking about that crossword puzzle from Tuesday morning, 7 across. Hidden talent. She'd never figured out the answer, and then she thought about Robert. Not the Robert from the end when the Alzheimer's had stolen so much of who he was. She thought about the Robert who used to dance with her in the kitchen while dinner was cooking. The Robert who would stop whatever he was doing just to listen when she hummed while folding laundry. The Robert who told her over and over that her voice was a gift. "You have something the world needs to hear," he'd whispered to her just 2 weeks before he died during one of his rare, clear moments. "Promise me you won't keep it to yourself forever." She'd promised. Sitting by his hospital bed, holding his hand that felt so small and fragile, she'd promised. The casting director cleared his throat. "Ma'am? If you could just—" But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She was remembering something else. The night before Robert's funeral, when she couldn't sleep, she'd gone to his workshop in the garage. It still smelled like sawdust and the aftershave he'd worn for 30 years. On his workbench, she'd found a note in his handwriting. Just 4 words. "Let them hear you." She'd kept that note in her purse ever since. "Excuse me," Margaret said quietly. The casting director paused. "Yes?" Margaret took a deep breath. Her voice was soft, but something in her tone made the two women at the table look up from their papers. "I buried my husband 6 months ago." The room went very still. The casting director's hand slipped off the door handle. "He had Alzheimer's," Margaret continued, her voice growing steadier. "For 3 years, I watched this brilliant man, this man who could fix any engine, who built our whole house with his own hands, who remembered the birthday of every kid in our neighborhood. I watched him disappear piece by piece." She could feel tears starting, but she didn't stop talking. "By the end, he didn't remember my name. He didn't remember our daughter. He didn't remember our wedding day or our first house or any of the 1,000 little moments that made up our life together." One of the women at the table had put down her pen. The other was staring at Margaret with an expression that was no longer dismissive. "But you know what he never forgot?" Margaret's voice was stronger now. "Music." when words failed. Him when he couldn't remember how to tie his shoes or what day it was, he could still hum along when I sang to him. Music was the only thing that could still reach him. The casting director had moved away from the door. He was listening now, really listening. Every night for those last 3 years, I sang him to sleep. The same song his mother used to sing to him when he was little. Even when he couldn't say my name, he would close his eyes and smile when I sang. Like for just those few minutes, he was himself again. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her makeup was probably ruined, but she didn't care anymore. The night before he died, he grabbed my hand. He looked right at me, really looked at me the way he used to, and he said, "Don't let your music die with me." Then he made me promise I would share it with the world, just once. The room was completely quiet now. Even the noise from the main hall seemed muted. "I know I don't look like what you're expecting," Margaret said, glancing down at her simple dress. "I know I'm not young or glamorous or whatever it is you usually see on television, but I made a promise to the man I loved for 31 years. I promised him I would try." She looked directly at the casting director, and for the first time, since she'd walked into that room, she felt like he was really seeing her. "So you can send me home if you want. You can tell me I'm too old or too plain or too ordinary. But I'm not leaving without keeping my promise. I came here to sing, and I'm going to sing." The silence stretched on. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the air conditioning humming. She could hear voices from the hallway, but they seemed to come from another world. Finally, the casting director spoke. "What song?" "I'm sorry?" "What song did you sing to your husband?" Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. "It's an old lullaby. His mother taught it to me when we first got married. She said it had been in their family for generations." "Sing it." The words were so simple, but they hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. "Here? Now? Right here. Right now. No music, no microphone, no stage. Just you and that song." Margaret looked around the small room. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unflattering. The carpet was industrial gray. The walls were bare except for a few posters about fire safety. This wasn't how she'd imagined it. But then again, life rarely happens the way we imagine it. She closed her eyes and thought about Robert. Not the sick Robert, but the Robert who used to hold her while she sang. The Robert who told her she had a gift. The Robert who made her promise. When she opened her mouth, the first notes came out shaky. Her voice was rusty from months of silence. But as she continued, something magical happened. The shakiness faded away, replaced by something pure and beautiful and true. The lullaby was in a language most people wouldn't recognize, a dialect from Robert's grandmother's village in Eastern Europe. The words didn't matter. The meaning was in the melody, in the love behind it, in the years of devotion it represented. Margaret sang about moonlight on water and mothers watching over sleeping children. She sang about love that endures even when memory fails. She sang about promises kept and hearts that remember what minds forget. As she sang, she forgot about the fluorescent lights and the gray carpet and the 3 strangers watching her. She was back in Robert's hospital room holding his hand, giving him the only gift she had left to give. When the last note faded away, Margaret opened her eyes. The casting director was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. One of the women had tears running down her cheeks. The other was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles were white. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then, very quietly, the casting director said, "Mrs. Chen, I owe you an apology." Margaret blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I judged you the moment you walked in here. I saw your age, your clothes, your ordinariness, and I decided I knew everything about you. I was wrong." He sat down heavily in his chair, like the weight of his mistake was physically pressing on him. "In 20 years of doing this job, I've heard thousands of auditions. Professional singers, trained performers, people who've been preparing their whole lives for a moment like this. But what you just did?" He shook his head. "That wasn't just singing. That was pure human emotion set to music. That was a story only you could tell." Margaret felt dizzy. Was this really happening? I need to ask you something, the casting director continued. Are you prepared for what comes next? Because if I put you through to the next round, your life is going to change. The cameras, the interviews, the pressure, it's not easy. Margaret thought about Lucy's face when she'd suggested the audition. She thought about Robert's note still folded in her purse. She thought about the promise she'd made. I'm ready, she said. And for the first time in months, she meant it. What happened next was like something out of a movie, except Margaret's life had never been the kind that belonged in movies. The casting director, who had introduced himself as David, was making phone calls. Important phone calls, judging by the way his voice changed when he spoke. You need to hear this, he kept saying into his phone. No, I'm serious. Cancel whatever you're doing and get down here right now. Margaret sat in that same uncomfortable plastic chair, but somehow, it didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. The two women from the panel, Janet and Patricia, had stayed to talk with her. They weren't the same cold professional people who had barely looked at her an hour ago. They were asking about Robert, about her life in Millbrook, about how she'd learned to sing. My mother taught me when I was little, Margaret explained. She said music was the universal language, that it could reach people when words couldn't. She was right, Janet said softly. She was the younger of the two women, probably around Lucy's age, but she had kind eyes. What you did in there, I've never seen anything like it. Patricia nodded. I've been working in television for 15 years and I thought I'd seen everything, but you proved me wrong today. Margaret still couldn't quite believe this was happening. I don't understand, I'm just me. I'm nobody special. That's where you're wrong, Janet said. Do you know what most people who audition for this show have in common? Margaret shook her head. They're performing. They're putting on a character, trying to be what they think we want to see. But you? You were just being yourself. You were sharing your heart. And that's the rarest thing in the world. Before Margaret could respond, David came back with 3 other people. She could tell they were important by the way everyone suddenly stood up straighter. One was an older woman with silver hair and the kind of confidence that comes from years of making big decisions. The other 2 were men in expensive suits who looked like they probably flew on private jets. Margaret, David said, I'd like you to meet Helen Rodriguez. She's the executive producer of the show. Helen stepped forward and shook Margaret's hand. Her grip was firm and she looked Margaret straight in the eye. Mrs. Chen, David tells me you have quite a story. I suppose I do, Margaret said, though she still felt like she was living in someone else's life. Would you be willing to share it with us? And perhaps sing again? Margaret's stomach fluttered. Here? With all of you watching? If you're comfortable with that. I know it's not exactly a proper audition setting. Margaret looked around the room. More people had gathered. Production assistants, camera operators. People she didn't recognize but who all seemed to be hanging on every word. Word had spread somehow, and everyone wanted to see what all the fuss was about. I suppose I could, Margaret said quietly. Helen smiled. Take your time, tell us about your husband. Tell us about the song. So Margaret did. She told them about meeting Robert at a church social when she was 21 and he was 23. How he'd been too shy to ask her to dance, so she'd asked him instead. How he'd proposed during a thunderstorm because he couldn't wait for better weather. How they'd built their life together one small, precious day at a time. She told them about the diagnosis that changed everything. How the doctors had explained what Alzheimer's would do. How it would steal Robert away from her piece by piece. How some days he would look at her like she was a stranger, and other days he would remember everything so clearly it broke her heart. The music was our bridge, she said. When he couldn't find words, when he couldn't remember what year it was or where he lived, the songs were still there, hidden somewhere safe inside him. The room was completely silent. Margaret could see people wiping their eyes, trying to be discreet about it. The lullaby was special, she continued. His grandmother had taught it to his mother, and his mother taught it to me. She said it was about watching over the people you love, even when you can't be with them anymore. Would you sing it for us? Helen asked gently. Margaret nodded. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. Not the hospital room or the machines or the smell of disinfectant. She remembered Robert in their kitchen, humming while he made pancakes on Sunday mornings. She remembered the way he used to stop, whatever he was doing, just to listen when she sang while doing housework. When she began to sing, her voice was stronger than it had been in the audition room. The lullaby filled the space, weaving around the people gathered there, touching something deep inside each of them. The melody was simple but haunting. It spoke of love that transcends time and memory. It spoke of promises kept and hearts that remember what minds forget. It spoke of ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply because love demands it. As Margaret sang, she opened her eyes and saw something beautiful happening. The young production assistant who had been so dismissive at check-in was crying openly. One of the men in expensive suits had his hand over his heart. A camera operator had lowered his equipment and was just listening, completely absorbed. But it was Helen's face that surprised Margaret the most. This woman who had probably seen every kind of performance imaginable, who had built her career on knowing what audiences wanted, was looking at Margaret like she was witnessing something sacred. When the song ended, the silence stretched on for what felt like minutes. Margaret wondered if she should say something, but the moment felt too fragile to break with words. Finally, Helen spoke. "Margaret, in 30 years of television, I have never heard anything like that. You didn't just sing a song, you shared a piece of your soul." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. When David called and told us to drop everything to hear someone sing, I was skeptical. I thought maybe he'd finally lost his mind." A few people chuckled nervously. "But what you just did..." He shook his head. "That wasn't entertainment, that was art. That was truth. That was exactly what this show was created to showcase. Real people with real stories that need to be heard." Margaret felt overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Helen said simply. "Yes to what?" "We want to put you straight through to the live shows. No more auditions, no more rounds of elimination. You've earned your place on that stage." Margaret's knees felt weak. "The live shows? On television? In front of millions of people," Helen confirmed. "Your story, your voice, your husband's memory, it deserves to be shared with the world." Robert was right. You do have a gift the world needs to hear. The mention of Robert's name made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. He would have been so proud. "He is proud," Janet said softly. "I believe that with all my heart." David was grinning, like he'd just discovered gold. "Margaret, you need to understand what just happened here. In 20 years of casting, I've never seen anything like this. Word is already spreading through the building. Everyone wants to meet the woman who made Helen Rodriguez cry." "I made you cry?" Margaret asked, looking at Helen in surprise. Helen laughed and wiped her eyes. "Honey, you made everyone cry, and more importantly, you reminded us why we do this job. We're not just looking for the next pop star or the next viral video. We're looking for stories that matter, voices that heal, people who can touch hearts." Margaret thought about Lucy, probably sitting at home wondering how the audition had gone. She thought about Mrs. Patterson at the library, who would want to hear every detail. She thought about the empty house where Robert's chair still sat by the window. "When did the live show start?" she asked. 3 weeks, Helen said. "That gives us time to work together to help you get comfortable with the stage and the cameras. But Margaret, yes, don't change. Don't let anyone tell you to be different or to perform differently. What you have is authentic, and that's rarer than diamonds. Promise me you'll stay exactly who you are." Margaret smiled, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Purpose. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "I promise," she said. And she meant it. The 3 weeks between the casting call and the live show passed like a whirlwind. Margaret had always lived her life in slow, predictable rhythms, but suddenly everything was moving at lightning speed. Her quiet little house in Millbrook became Grand Central Station, with people coming and going at all hours. Lucy had taken time off work to help her mother navigate this new world. She'd always been proud of Margaret, but now she walked around with this glow of vindication, like she'd known all along that her mother was special and was thrilled that the rest of the world was finally catching on. "Mom, you're going to be on national television," Lucy kept saying, like she couldn't quite believe it herself. "Millions of people are going to hear you sing." The thought still made Margaret's stomach do flip-flops. She'd agreed to this in a moment of courage and grief, but now that it was becoming real, the magnitude of it was overwhelming. Helen had been true to her word. They weren't trying to change Margaret or make her into something she wasn't. But they did need to help her get comfortable with cameras and lights and performing on a stage that was bigger than her entire living room. The show's team had been nothing but kind. They'd arranged for Margaret to fly to Los Angeles for rehearsals, something she'd never done before. Lucy came with her, and they both stared out the airplane window like tourists, watching the country spread out below them like a patchwork quilt. The studio was even more impressive than the convention center had been. Everything was huge and professional and a little bit intimidating. But Helen had introduced Margaret to everyone personally, and somehow word of her audition had preceded her. People kept stopping her in the hallways, saying they'd heard about her story and couldn't wait to hear her sing. "You're already famous around here," Helen had told her with a smile. "The video of your audition has been circulating internally, and I've never seen the crew react to anyone the way they've reacted to you." The rehearsals were strange at first. Margaret had never performed with professional lighting or sound equipment. The stage monitors, speakers that let her hear herself, took some getting used to. But David, who had flown in specially to work with her, was patient and encouraging. "Don't think about the cameras," he kept telling her. "Don't think about the audience, just think about Robert. Sing to him, the way you always did." That helped. When Margaret closed her eyes and imagined she was back in their bedroom, singing Robert to sleep one more time, everything else faded away. The other contestants were a mixed bag. Some were kind and supportive, genuinely interested in her story, and excited to share the stage with her. Others were clearly threatened by the attention she was getting and made snide comments about novelty acts and sympathy votes. Margaret tried not to let it bother her. She wasn't here to win a competition or launch a singing career. She was here to keep a promise. 2 days before the live show, Helen sat down with Margaret for what she called a heart-to-heart. "I need to prepare you for something," Helen said gently. "Your story is going to be featured prominently tomorrow night. We're going to show footage of your audition, and I'm going to interview you about Robert before you perform." Margaret's hand started to shake. "I don't know if I can talk about him on television. It's still so hard." "I understand. But Margaret, your story is important. There are millions of people watching who have lost someone they love, who have watched Alzheimer's steal their spouse or parent or sibling. Your courage, your love, the way you honored Robert's memory, it's going to mean everything to them." That night, Margaret called her sister Beth in Phoenix. They hadn't talked much since Robert's funeral, but Margaret needed to hear a familiar voice. "I saw the commercials," Beth said. "They've been showing clips all week." "Margaret, I had no idea you could sing like that." "Neither did I, really." "Robert knew," Beth said softly. "He always said you had something special. I'm sorry I never really listened." "It's okay, I didn't listen either for the longest time. He would be so proud of you. You know that, right?" Margaret wiped her eyes. "I hope so." The day of the live show arrived faster than Margaret thought possible. The theater was enormous, with hundreds of audience members and cameras everywhere. Margaret had been assigned a dressing room with her name on the door, which still felt surreal. Lucy helped her get ready, fussing over her hair and makeup like she was preparing for her wedding. The show's stylist had helped Margaret pick out a dress, something elegant but simple in a deep blue that brought out her eyes. She looked like herself, just a more polished version. "You look beautiful, Mom," Lucy said, and Margaret could see tears starting in her daughter's eyes. "Don't you dare make me cry before I go on stage," Margaret warned, but she was smiling. The waiting was the hardest part. Margaret sat in her dressing room, listening to the other performances through the monitor. Some were incredible. Some were just okay. All of them made her wonder what she was doing there. Then it was time. Helen knocked on her door. Ready? No, Margaret said honestly. But I'm going anyway. Walking onto that stage was like stepping into another world. The lights were so bright she couldn't see the audience, but she could feel them. Hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting to see what this ordinary woman from a small town was going to do. Helen introduced her with such warmth and respect that Margaret felt some of her nerves settle. Then came the interview portion, and Margaret found herself talking about Robert like he was an old friend she was introducing to new people. She told them about his smile, his terrible jokes, the way he sang off-key in the shower. She told them about the diagnosis and the long goodbye, and the promise that had brought her here. By the time she finished talking, the audience was completely silent. Margaret could see people wiping their eyes in the front rows. "Ladies and gentlemen," Helen said, "Margaret Chen." The music started, not the lullaby, but something new. Margaret had worked with the show's musical director to arrange a song that would work for television, while still honoring Robert's memory. It was a hymn she'd sung in church for years, but now it was infused with all the love and loss and hope she'd been carrying. As she began to sing, something magical happened. Margaret forgot about the cameras and the lights and the millions of people watching at home. She forgot about the other contestants and the judges and the competition aspect of it all. She was just Margaret, singing her heart out, keeping a promise to the man she'd loved for 31 years. The song built and soared, and Margaret's voice carried every emotion she'd been holding inside for 6 months. When she reached the final notes, she opened her eyes and saw something she'd never expected. The entire audience was on their feet. Not just polite applause, but a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. People were crying openly, and Margaret could see the judges wiping their eyes. But the most amazing thing was what happened next. As the applause continued, Margaret began to see people in the audience holding up signs and photos. Pictures of their own loved ones who had passed away. Signs that said, "Thank you," and "You're not alone," and "Robert would be proud." Margaret realized that her story had given other people permission to grieve, to remember, to celebrate the people they'd lost. Her promise to Robert had become something bigger than she'd ever imagined. When the applause finally died down, the head judge stood up. "Margaret," he said, "I've been doing this for 10 years and I have never been more moved by a performance. You didn't just sing a song tonight. You reminded all of us what love looks like, what devotion looks like, what keeping a promise looks like." Margaret won that night, but not in the way she'd expected. She didn't win the competition. That went to a young man with an incredible voice and a bright future ahead of him. But she won something more valuable. She won the hearts of millions of viewers who saw themselves in her story. She won a new understanding of her own strength and purpose. Most importantly, she kept her promise to Robert. And in doing so, she discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations come not from becoming someone new, but from finally having the courage to be exactly who you've always been. The quiet librarian from Millbrook had found her voice, and in finding it, she'd helped millions of other people find theirs too.